plans about the upfront payment of $17 million to GPD were stalled by Chapman, who managed to put the meeting off for 6 months, until October of that year.
Chapman's stance throughout the meeting was to deny any knowledge of the 17.65. He said it's a number he'd heard quoted. He denied that his company had received any of that particular money.
Chapman felt it was none of the receiver's business. He was notoriously cavalier about where money came from and went to. The millions from racing sponsors were rarely accountable. He felt what he did with the profits from the DeLorean job was his affair.
We made a contract with Colin Chapman and with GPD, which was a company he owned in Switzerland, to do the engineering work. The contract called for the upfront payment of the profits on the contract to go to GPD. We took that contract to the government, to the Secretary for Northern Ireland, to the NIDA, and to the Bank of England, and had it approved prior to entering into it. Once we did, before we could make the payments, we had to go to the Bank of England and again to the same people who issued the checks to make the payments. They agreed to it, and they knew exactly what was happening.
DeLorean and Chapman kept pointing out the GPD contract was legal. But Chapman claimed to the receiver that the $17 million payment to GPD was an introductory fee for bringing him and DeLorean together.
He came across relaxed, very confident, as I say, very healthy, with a very good suntan. And he seemed to be convinced of what he was telling us. He seemed to take the view that if he answered our questions and if we were sensible chaps, we would understand his explanation. He didn't seem to be anything other than perfectly normal to him that $17.5 million could be paid as an introductory fee.
But Chapman's story was contradicted by a letter adding a condition to the GPD contract, a copy of which journalists investigating the DeLorean affair had been handed anonymously. They eventually put it before Fred Bushell, Chapman's finance director.
And finally we produced a letter which had been signed by Colin Chapman and by Fred Bushell in that hotel in 1978 in Geneva, which actually committed the Group Lotus, that's the public company, guaranteeing GPD's work. It actually specifically named GPD. The Group Lotus was guaranteeing GPD. Now this letter was dynamite. And we put that letter on the table, and Fred Bushell said, "I've never seen that letter before." And I said, "Is that your signature?" And he said, "Well, it might be." I said, "Well, it's outside of your signature. The thing is a forgery. But if it's not a forgery, this letter actually does show that not only did you know about GPD, but you actually guaranteed GPD's work as a public company. And the shareholders never knew that. You were guaranteeing an enormous contract, which would bust Group Lotus, and very nearly did." At that stage, he asked for a pause. And I remember we went out, and the tension in the room was crackling.
This letter proved that the shareholders of Lotus were being defrauded. Chapman and Bushell had failed to declare to the Lotus shareholders the upfront profit paid to GPD, which eventually showed up in Chapman and Bushell's Swiss accounts. November 1978 marked a turning point for Chapman. At the peak of his racing career, having won his 7th World Championship, he was made a freeman of Norwich, only 5 days after signing the DeLorean contract, knowing he had crossed the line between bending the rules and serious fraud. Behind his public confidence, life was getting complicated.
He was by that time taking amphetamines and almost certainly sleeping tablets. He and I were once forced to share a hotel room in America, and he set an alarm for 4 o'clock in the morning, took 2 little yellow tablets and said, "Well, they'll wake me up at 6, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed." And I was finding that his memory was seeming to go, and that if I had a meeting with him and there was a major decision to be taken, I was having to cover them myself with a memo to him, a memo to his secretary, and a third one to his house to say, "This is to confirm what we agreed at 11 o'clock this morning."
According to his assistant, Chapman's private life was also getting confused with his family life.
You're coming to dinner at the house tonight? I said, oh, I am? Yeah. Hazel would like a word with you. Okay. I said, can you give me a clue? Yeah, well, he said, what happened was, the other night, I was out with and I was at a traffic signal and Hazel drew up in her Elite beside me. So I said, so she saw? Yeah. I said, what did you do? He said, I just put my foot down, went through the lights. So I said, okay, fine. So I said, so what did you say afterwards? He said, well, this is where I need your help. What I said was that you'd taken out, you'd gone down to Lalaconda, the local Italian restaurant at Blowfield, and you'd got drunk, made a bit of a fuss, had called me up. I'd gone out there in my Merc to pick you both up, and I was coming back, you were laid out on the back seat, and that's how Hazel didn't see you, but you were there. Is that okay? I said, well, I could probably, get on with that, yeah. So we go to dinner that night, and there's Hazel one end and Colin the other end, and we start this meal, and it's real frosty. So halfway through the meal, Hazel puts down her cutlery. She said, I'm sorry, I just have to get this off my chest right now, Tim. She said, I am absolutely disgusted with you. I said, how's that, Hazel? You are a director of a public company of which my husband is the chairman. How dare you go out locally with girls and get drunk and make an exhibition of yourself in a public restaurant and have my husband have to come and pick you up? I thought, okay, I can take this. I look at Colin, he looks down the table, he said, this has got to stop, Tim. Anyway, I go out to the porch saying goodnight. Hazel's got it off her chest. The old man turns around and he says, Tim, Hazel's got a point, you've got to start behaving yourself, you've got to live up to the position I've put you in. And I'm walking out to my car thinking, hold it, this guy now actually believes what he's told her. And I think, if you ask other people who were around in those last couple of years, 3 years, he really began to get scary from that point of view, really scary, that he would believe those things.
Into this world of make-believe came a fairy tale sponsor, awash with money. The Albert Hall, February 1980. $1 million worth of smoke, champagne and dancing girls launched Chapman's latest Lotus. Yet no one had ever heard of Essex, the name emblazoned on the car. Essex, a Monaco-based oil dealing company, was owned by entrepreneur David Team.
Team was the sole successor to John Player. His company was called Essex. A very odd man team anyway to have anything to do with Formula One. From an art background, he was a true 1960s character, complete with ponytail and everything else, and a saturnine and a strange man who operated basically out of telephones and computers inside a Monaco apartment dealing in spot oil.
The world of oil dealing was extremely volatile. In 1 year, David Team made $70 million. Chapman was mesmerized by the orgy of cash.
We were looking at various avenues to see what we could do to, as we say, illuminate our profile within the petroleum industry. And the two obvious ways to get the people through sports are football and motorism. The petroleum industry really has nothing to do with football. So we decided to go motorism.
And David Team lived in Monte Carlo and gave all the signs of being incredibly wealthy with his personal jet. And that had an impact on Colin. Previously, he wasn't bothered about going to a good restaurant or staying at a good hotel. He would make sure Hazel had a nice hotel to stay at, but it didn't really bother him. And if you were travelling with him, a kitty cat in the cockpit of the aeroplane was all he wanted. But then he understood what the rosettes and stars meant in the guides, and he spent less time with the cars, less time with the mechanics, and more time away from the circuit.
Despite Team's millions, Lotus hadn't won a single race since the DeLorean deal was signed. Team was arrested at an airport in Switzerland in April 1981. The charges were dropped and he was completely cleared, but his Essex empire had collapsed. The fairy tale was over. John Player returned as sponsor, but Chapman's luck did not. This last great innovation never reached the starting grid.
It's meeting a lot of resistance from the traditionalists in racing who see it as a threat to the traditional way of building a racing car. There's two cars really. There's the car that the driver sits in, this bit in the middle, which is softly sprung, and then there's the bodywork which carries all the aerodynamic load which holds the car on the ground, which has got another set of springs, and as you can see, if you move, it goes down separately from the rest of the car.
A brilliant idea, but a desperate throw at the edge of the rules. It was soon banned for good. Chapman was shattered. Losing races, Lotus facing bankruptcy, having lost its US distribution, and the DeLorean affair about to explode, disaster threatened from all sides.
The discussions I had with Colin late September 1982, he brought up subjects concerning his death to me which had never ever come up in conversation previously and wasn't a subject which he would normally talk to me about. In fact, it was a little bit of a taboo subject. He was very, very cold about other people dying and had never ever shown any requirement to discuss anything in those lines, even if it was just preparation.
Chapman had raised Britain to the top of Grand Prix racing. His energy, charisma and innovative genius affected all who came into contact with him. But the constant pressure of finding finance had driven him to the GPD contract, which now threatened everything he had built up over 30 years. By the end of 1982, imprisonment, ruin and disgrace threatened to overwhelm him. A week before Christmas, he flew back from Paris, landing in darkness. He would not see the dawn. At 4 a.m. he died of a massive heart attack in his wife's arms. It was December the 16th, 1982, and Chapman was 54. 10 years after Chapman's death, his loyal accountant Fred Bushell pleaded guilty to fraud in relation to the DeLorean affair and was sentenced to 3 years in jail. At his trial, the judge said on the evidence before him, if Chapman had been in the dock, he would have got 10 years.